Hi everyone, I want to welcome everyone to Cultural Exchanges 2022. Thank you for booking onto our event. I'm very excited for this one, I've got to say. But yes, this is our final event of the week. I just want to thank everyone, whether this is your first event or your second, your third, for getting involved. We really do appreciate it. And without further ado, I'll pass you on to Professor Kenneth Morrison. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kenneth Morrison. I'm a professor of modern Southeast European history and the director for Peace, Equality and Social Justice Research Team here at the university. I'll be chairing tonight's event, and I'm very much looking forward to what I think will be a fascinating hour ahead. We're delighted to be joined by Jim Laurie this evening. Jim is an esteemed American foreign correspondent, documentary filmmaker, writer and broadcaster. He began his career as a freelance journalist working in Vietnam and Cambodia in 1970 before joining NBC News 2 years later. He reported on the conflicts for several years in both Cambodia and Vietnam and was one of the very few journalists who remained in Saigon to witness the fall of the city in April 1975. Jim then went on to have a glittering career, establishing the first ABC bureau in China, for example, where he reported on the Tiananmen Square protests. He also covered the final years of the Soviet Union, the first post-apartheid elections in South Africa, and wars in countries such as Bosnia-Herzegovina, Lebanon, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. He's the author of The Last Helicopter, Two Lives in Indochina, which is a memoir of his time reporting from Vietnam and Cambodia. And he's also the winner of the Peabody Prize for Journalism, the Overseas Press Club Awards, 2 Emmy Awards, and an Amnesty International Media Award for his human rights reporting. This evening, Jim will discuss his experiences as a foreign correspondent, the historical significant shifts that he's witnessed, and what lessons we might be able to draw from a career spent reporting on some of the most important events in global history over several decades. Jim, we're very much looking forward to hearing about your career as a foreign correspondent and discussing some of the issues you'll raise in your presentation. Welcome to De Montfort University. Over to you.
Thank you, Kenneth. It's very kind of you to say all those things. And my only regret is that I am not with you in Leicester. I should have been there, but I'm not. I had a little accident here in a place called St. Petersburg, Florida, where I am right now, and couldn't get on the plane to head off to the UK. But hopefully I'll get out to where you are at some future point. I'm going to talk today a bit about the wars that I have known over the last 52 years. The sad irony of this talk is that this is occurring on the 9th day of the worst war in Europe, perhaps in 77 years. My talk and the conversation with all of you, and I hope you will all join in to follow, will be part anecdotes of an old war reporter and part, I hope, and more usefully, a review of some of the remarkable history that I have witnessed over these many years. I'm going to start with some video clips and which recount what I've been through over the course of these 50 years. I'm going to have to stop the video there so I don't get ahead of myself. These videos will take you first, as you see, to Vietnam and to Cambodia, where I pitched up when I was 21 years old and a very green war reporter at that. First a freelancer and then going into American network television news. And I'll be then moving on after I talk about Vietnam and Cambodia and my earliest experiences to Beirut, Lebanon, on to Afghanistan, to Iraq, in between 2 wars, the Gulf War and then the Iraq War later on, to Bosnia. And I will end the little presentation here, which should last about 15 minutes, in Moscow, first in 1991, and then in 2003, when I had the opportunity to meet, I should say, 3 people that you may have heard of. One named Gorbachev, one named Boris Yeltsin, and the third named Vladimir Putin. We'll talk about that later. There are things that are not in this presentation. I won't be talking about China, at least not in the video, nor will I be talking about South Africa or Somalia, where I spent a lot of time over the years. A word here a little bit about video and changes in television and changes in video over the years. You will see the uneven quality of the film and the video you're going to see. When we began all of this back in 1970, we had no internet, we had no high definition television, we had no video. We had old-fashioned 8mm or 16mm film. It was pretty primitive, and you'll see how primitive it was when you see some of the film in this presentation. A lot of it is shot by myself on a small 8mm camera. A lot of it is from the American networks for whom I worked over the years. So fasten your seatbelts. We're going to cover a lot of history in a very short period of time. My arrival was in Vietnam in 1970. This is Saigon as it was back then. I'll let you feast on these pictures for a while, and I'll sort of add things as I go along here and there, but I'll let the pictures speak pretty much for themselves. You may have read work by Graham Greene. This is where he wrote his famous novel on Vietnam. This is downtown Saigon, and in the distance, the Caravel Hotel. I was thrust into the war because of this man, Richard Nixon. He decided in 1970 to launch an invasion from South Vietnam into Cambodia. He did so because the previous longtime head of Cambodia, a man who I came to know named Norodom Sihanouk, had been overthrown, and a government more friendly to the United States had been imposed, or had been installed, I should say, in Phnom Penh. So Nixon ordered his invasion, and the war became much wider, and my job as a young reporter became much bigger as I moved from Vietnam to Cambodia. The Americans had launched massive bombing in the countryside. The North Vietnamese throughout the countryside were committing all sorts of terror. But the amount of bombs, well over 2 million tons, was equal to that which was dropped over all of Europe by the UK and the US during World War II. The refugee crisis, as with all wars, became bigger and bigger. I was in the field meeting young Khmer commanders just outside of Phnom Penh, and with my little press IDs in hand, was going back and forth between Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and Saigon, Vietnam, for the better part of 5 years, off and on. All of this is told, of course, in the book, which Kenneth has remarked on, The Last Helicopter, 2 Lives in Indochina. This is a book, really a very personal story. It is both a story of war, a memoir of war, but it is also a story, a very personal story of people I met, particularly the young woman who I met in Cambodia, a woman named Sok Sinan. And her story is told in tandem with mine. So you have the perspective in this book of an American war correspondent and all he went through in Vietnam and Cambodia, and then a young Khmer woman and what she was going through during the same war. More on that a little bit later. Combat reporting for a young guy who knew very little, who was rather cowardly, and probably the greenest guy in Vietnam, was quite an adventure. In those days, I'm sure there's nothing today that really trains you or prepares you for combat and war reporting. All you know is you're out there, you're facing danger, and you do the best you can.
Quang Tri City is all but surrounded. NBC News correspondent Jim Laurie has been there, and here's his report.
This is where the South Vietnamese have chosen to stand and fight after retreating for nearly 15 miles from the DMZ. They call it the Dong Ha Line. The Marines have stretched their tanks and artillery along this line on the south side of the Dong Ha River. This is the gateway to Quang Tri City, the provincial capital 6 miles south on Route 1. The South Vietnamese must hold this line and think they can. There are reports some North Vietnamese units have sneaked across the Dong Ha River and are hiding in these houses on the north side of town. There's no return fire.
While American forces were withdrawn from Vietnam in 1973, the war in Vietnam and in neighboring Cambodia dragged on to April 1975. Then I was in Phnom Penh with my friend. She had still remained in Cambodia. She was very much a nationalist who believed in her country, was very much in love with her life in Cambodia, as I tell in my book. But then on April the 12th, a sudden decision by the American embassy to evacuate, to leave Cambodia, to leave the Cambodians basically to their own in fighting the Khmer Rouge. You probably have heard about the Khmer Rouge, which in many respects was the most radical communist movement in the world. It was a ruthless organization which took Cambodia back to, as they said at the time, year zero. And so what followed the events you're about to see was one of the most chilling periods of world history. But April 12th was the day that I had to say goodbye to Cambodia. So with the steles of the various Phnom Penh temples beneath me, I said goodbye. And sadly, I left behind the woman that I had come to know very well over the previous 5 years. There was a miscommunication, all of which is told in my book, and she was left to deal with the Khmer Rouge, which took over in the next few days. Sok Sanan was her name, and her story is perhaps much more riveting than mine about the war. But the two together present two very different perspectives on a war that was perhaps the most destructive, at least in my memory, to certainly two and perhaps even more countries of the world. I should add at this point that the story of Sok Sanan is a tragic one, but with a lot of hope, because in her story are lessons in survival from the most dire conditions. And I hope that you'll be able to read that story, and it's available, of course, on Amazon. I was in Saigon next, went from Cambodia back to Vietnam to witness the end of the war in Vietnam. I was hoping, perhaps because my friend Sinan had friends in Saigon, that she might somehow make it from Cambodia to Vietnam. None of us knew at that time how difficult that would be, nor how horrible the Khmer Rouge that took over Cambodia would be. But April 30th, 1975, I waved goodbye again, not this time, not on a helicopter, but to the last helicopter that left the roof of the U.S. Embassy.
NBC News correspondent Jim Laurie is one of the few Americans still left in Saigon. Here from Saigon Radio Hookup is Laurie's report on the surrender.
In the words of General Min, we are here to hand over the power of government to you in order to avoid bloodshed.
The U.S. Embassy behind me has been completely looted. The South Vietnamese obviously are angry at the American withdrawal. Many of them have said that they were left out in the evacuation. They were unable to make the helicopters. Many of them were American employees. They have had to stay, and they will now have to stay and cope with communism in South Vietnam.
The rest of the story I will leave to those of you who would like to read the book about this important period of history, and of course we'll talk more about it in our conversation a little bit later on. But after the Vietnam War was over, I went on to other wars. There's one funny thing about being a foreign correspondent is once you do one war, you get branded. The next thing you know, your editor, either in New York or London, says, get on the plane, go cover another war. So the following year, I was in Beirut, Lebanon, not knowing very little.
There was more sniper and machine gun fire in Beirut.
Not knowing very much, I should say, about Lebanon or the war
Today,
there.
the premier of Lebanon tried to patch together another ceasefire, and he did get Muslim gunmen to move back from some Beirut luxury hotels. Jim Laurie has a report now on the various factions involved in the Lebanese fighting.
It's a confusing combination of political organizations that makes up the leftist street fighters in this civil war. The other side's simpler, two right-wing groups, Christian, well-disciplined, educated. But here on the left, there are more than a dozen groups. Marxists, Palestinians, Muslims, and those claiming ties going back to the late President Nasser of Egypt.
By 1989, I had shifted again, this time Afghanistan, as the Russians, the Soviets, as we knew them then, were pulling out after 10 years.
The conventional wisdom is that when the Soviets have finally completely withdrawn from the country sometime in the next couple of weeks, the Afghans will set on one another and the capital will be even more dangerous than it is now. While the diplomats were leaving, ABC's Jim Laurie was flying in to take a look.
Flying into the mountain-ringed Afghan capital is enough to take your breath away. The Soviet transport circles quickly downward, firing magnesium flares to divert any heat-seeking missiles. The American armed anti-Soviet Mujahideen guerrillas are believed in the mountains around the city. Soviet helicopters also escort every landing.
They were heading home, pushing through the pre-dawn hours to daylight, heading north along Afghanistan's Salang Highway. Helicopter gunships provided air cover. Aboard our armored personnel carrier, Captain Valery Malenkov. He'd seen 4 years action here, said he's happy to be going home, but would come back if called.
The convoys heading home have now passed through the mountains of the Hindu Kush, where the Mujahideen, the anti-Soviet rebels, are held up. The rebels the Soviets have failed to defeat. Now we're out into open land, only 30 miles now to the Soviet border.
The defense of this nation is now left to the Soviet-trained and equipped Afghan army. The Kabul government today ordered martial law in the city, President Najibullah vowing to go it alone in a major political rally.
A few footnotes here. I was back again in Afghanistan in 2001, at the beginning of the American war there. And then, as we all witnessed, I on television, and I would assume most of you on TV, we saw the end of the Afghan war in these panicked scenes from Kabul. And as an old war reporter, I could not help but notice this picture of a helicopter near the U.S. Embassy in Kabul was very similar to this photograph that I took of a helicopter above the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, Vietnam in 1975. History repeats itself, but often does so in a very sad way. The 1990s found me in Baghdad, Moscow, and Sarajevo.
This is the start of another battle in which the people of Iraq will be victorious, he said.
It seems doubtful that the Iraqis will suddenly become fully cooperative after only a few airstrikes. Jim Laurie, ABC News, Baghdad.
And knowing that Kenneth had a specialty in Yugoslavia, or what is now Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia, I include these reports from that part of the world.
In Dobrinja, only the Bosnian defenders venture far into the open. For this Muslim suburb, which once housed Olympic athletes, is under a siege more intense than anything central Sarajevo, 4 miles away, has seen. Nearly 35,000 people have been trapped here in their apartments for 52 days. Very few dare to cross Serbian lines to get out or get in.
In Bosnia-Herzegovina, a United Nations aid convoy remains trapped in Mostar for a second night. ABC's Jim Laurie went into Mostar with the convoy.
The way out of Mostar was across a littered no man's land. Muslims and Croats have been battling it out here for 4 months. We escorted 5 badly wounded children being evacuated by a private relief worker from Britain. Among them, 10-year-old Selma, covered in shrapnel wounds. She had lost an arm, she could lose an eye. Yet these children were the lucky ones to escape from the hell on earth which is Mostar.
trapped behind about 30,000 people, and trapped with them, too, the UN relief convoy, which Wednesday wound its way through tough terrain to bring in the first food and medicine for months. The convoy blockaded by a desperate people and a Muslim army which is losing the war on all fronts. Several Muslim soldiers began erecting barricades just behind me using buses, and then the people turned out. The demands: unless the UN could help guarantee the security of Mostar, the UN convoy would be held hostage. Women sit down in front of the UN vehicles. Efforts by UN officials to negotiate their way out have turned into shouting matches. The crowds make impossible demands. The UN must take up guns and fight for us, some told me. We will die as soon as the UN leaves because the Croats are just waiting to launch bigger attacks. Mostar is a city of rubble where you learn quickly what is outgoing or incoming fire. A place with no electricity, where collecting water puts you in the sights of snipers, where thousands sleep in crowded basement shelters because they've lost their homes. It's a place of constant agony, where for every wounded child evacuated, another replaces him. 3-year-old Almira and 5-year-old Damir eating breakfast when a tank round blew apart their kitchen. Fear, anger, and despair, born of the sight of wounded children, that has pushed people here to blockade an aid convoy, to see the UN as their last chance for survival. Jim Laurie, ABC News in Mostar.
That was from 1993. Finally, I'm going to move on to the Soviet Union and to Russia and what it's become today. Twice in my career, I was able to meet fairly important people in visits to the Kremlin.
The tension is extremely high around the Russian Federation building.
First in August 1991 at the Kremlin. It's quite an extraordinary experience being there, and especially at a time when two Soviet Union leaders were going to be appearing before us. Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin.
Jim Laurie.
Доброе утро.
For those of you who may have read about the history of Boris Yeltsin, in some respects you can attribute Yeltsin as the man who put Putin in power, because Vladimir Putin was appointed the temporary president of Russia by Yeltsin, as Yeltsin was in his waning days as president of Russia. This is probably the last time that you see Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin together in the same room, because 6 months later, the Soviet Union was officially dissolved and the Federation of Russia began its new lease on life. 2003, I'm back in the Kremlin again, and this fellow is before us.
Как беспокоила, так и беспокоит, конечно, проблема терроризма и тем более возможность попадания в руки террористов оружия массового уничтожения. Это, конечно, очень чувствительная, болезненная даже, я бы сказал, тема для всего международного сообщества.
And I will leave you with a question, and we can talk about anything in this video next. And my question is, how did this man, who I met in 2003, become this man who is launching one of the most extraordinarily brutal invasions of Ukraine today? So with that, I'll end the video presentation and turn things back first to Kenneth, and we can open it up to any conversations you may want to have. Kenneth?
Jim, thank you so much. That's absolutely fascinating to see that footage over a almost 50-year period, from the very early images you took on an 8mm camera in Phnom Penh and Saigon, all the way through to meeting Vladimir Putin in 2003, of course, which makes your talk particularly topical. We've got a few questions coming in from the audience, but if I can, I'm going to allow myself chair's privilege and ask a couple of my own questions before we move on to those from the audience. I wondered what motivated you as a young man to embark upon a career, as you said, at 21 years old, which is pretty young, to throw yourself into a situation like that, particularly at the time, because the journalists at that time covering Vietnam were of a slightly different generation. Many were much older and more established. What motivated you as a young man to go there as a freelancer and to embark upon such a career?
In one respect, I was a university dropout. I was in university studying history, specializing in East Asian history, and I got very bored, I'm afraid, with a few of the lectures that I had in my history classes in university. So I got on a plane.
That would never happen at Montfort, of course.
It would never happen. I'm sure it would never happen there. But I couldn't continue when I knew I could get on a plane and go to the places that I was studying. And my ambition at first was to go to China. That was always my ambition. I wanted to go to China. But in 1970, it was almost impossible to get a visa for China. And so first I went to Japan, then Taiwan, then to Hong Kong, tried to get a visa, and then I ran out of money. And somebody said, why don't you go to Vietnam? There's a war going on there. So for the enormous sum of $250 a week, I went off to Vietnam. And it was really almost an accidental introduction to being a war reporter, because I had no experience whatsoever as a war reporter. I had worked on the university newspaper, on the university radio station. But in terms of education in what I was really doing, it was all on-the-job education.
So when you were in Cambodia and Vietnam, you witnessed in particular the American bombing of Cambodia. You witnessed the penetration of the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, towards Saigon in 1975. I want to ask you about your decision to remain in Saigon after the US evacuation in April 1975, because, you know, through my own research, I know that most foreign journalists left Saigon on those helicopters, if they hadn't already got out before that. What motivated you to stay in, knowing that you were probably one of very, very few Americans and one of very few foreign journalists who remained in the city? What motivated you to stay? And do you think that by staying, and with yourself and the cameraman Neil Davis capturing those images of the North Vietnamese Army taking control of Saigon, was in some way a kind of a career maker for you?
Well, first, the reasons that I went into Vietnam after being evacuated in the American embassy pullout from Phnom Penh, Cambodia, were very personal. I had in the back of my mind the hope that I could be reunited with the woman that I had left behind, not intentionally, but by mistake, in Cambodia. And Sok Sanan, I felt, might possibly get to Vietnam, and perhaps we could get together again. I was determined to figure out a way of getting her out of what I did not really know at the time was as horrible a situation as she became involved in as the days, weeks, and months went on. So it was a personal decision, first of all. It had nothing to do really with career or reporting, but I did have the good fortune of knowing, as you mentioned, the man named Neil Davis. He was an extraordinary, about 10 years older than I, extraordinary Australian journalist who had covered both Vietnam and Cambodia for many, many more years than I was ever there. And he had an innate understanding of how everything worked. And I figured that if I were with him, I'd have a pretty good chance of coming out of his experience alive. So it was a combination of a personal motivation and then knowing that I had somebody with me who really knew what he was doing when I perhaps did not know what I was doing.
In a sense, the Vietnam War was a conflict that could be relatively easily explained to the American public. And of course, it was on American television and newspapers on a daily basis. But I wondered about, for example, the conflicts in Lebanon or Bosnia. These were very complex wars in which there were myriad armed groups participating in them. Were those conflicts particularly difficult to convey to an American audience or an English-speaking audience because of those complexities?
Very difficult indeed. In fact, I am not sure I did a good job on either war. looking back upon it, because they were wars that I didn't really understand. I didn't have the depth of knowledge of either Lebanon or of Bosnia that I had with wars in Vietnam and Cambodia. So the other issue is I have always worked in radio and television. And when you're given 2 minutes and 30 seconds, or maybe 3 minutes at most, to explain a story, it's almost impossible to capture all the nuance and all the complexities of these stories. So as you may have seen that little clip that I showed of the war in Lebanon, I was trying my best to show the various factions that were involved in the early stages of that in Beirut. In the case of Bosnia, even more complex. You saw the two clips that I had. One was the Serbs against the Bosniaks, or the Bosnian Muslims, and the other was the Croats against the Bosnian Muslims in two different parts of the country. So the other issue that I had is editors back in New York at the time, and I'm not quite sure how it was in the UK at the time, they had very little patience for hearing very much about the war in Bosnia. It was not the kind of war that they felt was of the utmost importance to the American public. There were, after all, no American forces at that time in Bosnia. So it was very different from an Iraq war or a Gulf war where there was a vested American interest. It was only when, as we get close to 1995, that the Americans finally get involved with the peacemaking exercises, that there was more interest in the story, and perhaps I'd be given a little bit more airtime to explain a little bit more of what I thought was going on there.
And of course, that's one of the problems with television news, and increasingly so, that the time you have in which to explain a story, particularly if it's a complex story like a war taking place in, for the American public, it's taking place in the Balkans, it's Southeast Europe, they maybe don't think it's necessarily relevant to them. It's extremely difficult in that compressed time to tell the story well. And I know that's a challenge faced by other journalists who reported. In a sense, the siege of Sarajevo was easier to explain, but more broadly, as you said, because Bosnia became a very complex situation on the ground, a very difficult one for foreign correspondents to convey. Let's move on to Moscow, because I think most of our questions will probably be about Moscow before we move on to the questions from the audience. Now, you witnessed, as Moscow correspondent for ABC, the dissolution of the Soviet Union when it eventually came, and the fall of the Berlin Wall was in November 1989, but of course the Soviet Union didn't dissolve until 1991. And you witnessed the end of that state, the creation of the successor states of the Soviet Union, including the Russian Federation. And then you witnessed the rise to power of Vladimir Putin. And I wondered what your initial impressions of Putin were, particularly at a time when Putin was regarded somewhat by the West as a partner in the war on terror post September the 11th, 2001. So what were your initial impressions of him then, and what are your impressions of him now?
Yes, this is something that actually has really haunted me over the course of the last month or so, as we've watched Putin push the Ukraine into a totally unprovoked invasion and in war. It's funny, Putin impressed me when I met him way back in 2003 as exceedingly bright, exceedingly calculating, exceedingly analytical, and analytical because in the sense that as a former KGB guy, I didn't think that he was a KGB operative in the sense of being out there and being a frontline officer, but rather an analytical type. He talked off camera to me about a number of issues, including his time in the KGB when he was in Germany, the time when the wall was coming down. But one thing I could sense from him is this very strong nationalism. And he told a story of how when he was in Germany, East Germany, as the wall was coming down, he would call Moscow for instructions. And he said, nothing came from Moscow. And he seemed determined at that point to make sure there was never a weak Moscow again, that every time anybody would call Moscow, there'd be somebody with firm decision-making in power in Moscow. Now, it strikes me people have been saying during the current episode that, well, we always knew that Putin would be a ruthless kleptocrat dictator, enamored with great wealth and delusional power and a desire to return Russia to either Tsarist days or to the days of the Soviet Union with all of its influence. I'm not sure that was so clear, at least in 2003 when I first met him. And it is extraordinary to me to watch a man who does seem to have changed over these years, because to me, almost everything he told me at that time was very rational. And that rationality seems to have been lost in the character of Vladimir Putin in 2022.
Is it possible, do you think, that if indeed it's true that Russian forces are stalling in Ukraine and resistance has been perhaps tougher than they expected, that this special military operation, so-called, in the Russian media is actually not working as effectively as possible? Is it possible that we could get to a situation where we see them using much heavier weapons, as they did in Chechnya, for example, in the 1990s and again in the early 2000s? Could we be looking at that kind of scenario, you think?
I think we already are, Kenneth. I think we already are. I think that the Chechnya, the Syrian style of warfare, the artillery, all kinds of weapons from the air, missiles, that will be their principal means of warfare. And that is, of course, as we all know, the most deadly and the most dangerous for civilians. I think that this is going to get much worse, and I don't know what the end will be like. It is striking to me that nobody seems to be able to talk to Putin and talk him down off of this cliff, if you will, that he seems determined to jump off. I will say this about the Russian military. I was struck once when I was in Moscow years and years ago when it was the Soviet Union. And I was invited to a meeting with a leading general in the Soviet army, and went to the defense ministry. Got into the defense ministry and went to the lift, and the lift wasn't working. They didn't have the lift working in the Ministry of Defense. And I said to myself, what's wrong here? Is the Soviet military that we had come to fear and feel was of the utmost competence really as well equipped, well maintained, and competent as we had all thought? And I wonder the same thought today.
That's a very interesting observation. I wondered if the events on the ground that are playing out suggest exactly that perhaps the Russian forces are going to grind to a halt in certain areas. They may be able to take the cities, but of course it's a very different thing. As the Americans learned to their, to their detriment in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Let's move on to some of the questions from the audience, because we have quite a few. So we'll start with the first one, which is, what was your rationale in leaving Cambodia during the rise of the Khmer Rouge? I mean, actually, was there a sense that Pol Pot's Cambodia would be a more dangerous place to report from than the newly dubbed Ho Chi Minh City?
The remarkable thing about working and living in Cambodia is we really did not know a tremendous amount about the Khmer Rouge. We knew that they were extremists. We knew that they had taken over most of the fighting from the North Vietnamese, who had trained them during the course of the war. We knew that they were becoming much more ferocious, lethal, extreme as the war went on. But we did not really know exactly what fate lay in store for Phnom Penh. And I must say, as I write in my book, the Cambodians struck me as very naive about the Khmer Rouge. There was that feeling that perhaps if the Khmer Rouge came in, they could actually talk to them. There would be some rationality among the leaders, and there could be a normal life for most Cambodians after the Khmer Rouge takeover. That was not to be. My rationale for leaving Phnom Penh when I did, when the American embassy pulled out, was very simple. I was the only reporter there for NBC News at the time, and I was told to get out and take the story with me. I was also trying to get out the woman that I knew there. Couldn't do that, unfortunately, until much later, but I had to go on and get out of Cambodia. Did I think that South Vietnam was a much better bet in terms of a journalist staying behind and covering the fall of Saigon and the rise of the communist forces? The answer is yes. Because whereas the Khmer Rouge had very little contact with the outside world during its 5 or 6 years as it was coming up and coming into power, the North Vietnamese communists in Hanoi had a long history of contacts with the West, with American reporters, both in Paris during the Paris peace talks and in Hanoi and other parts of Vietnam. So at least I knew that if I could reach the right people in Vietnam, the right communist officials, that I would be much better off because they were trained, if you will, to a certain degree in dealing with reporters and dealing with the West. Now, I must say, in those early days, it was very, very nervous times. I feared most angry South Vietnamese upset with any American or any Westerner who they blamed for having lost the war. Because South Vietnamese believed that while the Russians and the Chinese were well equipping and helping massively the North Vietnamese communists, the South Vietnamese had been left pretty much on their own when the Americans pulled out. The Americans had not given them enough arms, enough support, and so there was a great deal of bitterness. But as it turned out, we were all right. Through the cleverness of Neil Davis, who I rely heavily on, a very experienced reporter and cameraman, and just by sort of assessing things on the ground as they developed, we had actually a fairly good experience for nearly a month under the new communist rulers of Vietnam.
Let's move back to Russia for the next question. The next question is, do you feel that the current state of the Russian Federation is the natural path for the Russia you visited in the 1990s? Or, in your opinion, modern Russia is a product of Putin?
Well, I fear that Putin's ambition is to restore some of the glory of the old Soviet Union. Now, let me go back and say a bit more, however, about the old Soviet Union and the new Russia. One of the things that Putin has always said, I would say most Russian leaders would agree with, is that Russia needed boundaries, some sort of space between its strict boundaries and then the Western nations on the periphery. What America did not do at the end of the Soviet Union 1991 is offer, it seems to me, any guarantees or any promises to the Russians that they need not worry about the periphery. There was no real attempt to bring back NATO, which was, after all, created for the Soviet Union, not for an allegedly smaller Russia and a democratic Russia. It was there to protect the West against the more aggressive, it was felt at the time, Soviet Union. So what did the Americans offer the Russians? Well, I think Putin has picked up on that. They offered nothing. In fact, they increased NATO presence on the periphery, on the borders of Russia. So in some ways, it was perhaps the, I don't know, this is a poor choice of words, the lack of generosity, if you will, on the part of the victorious, in Cold War terms, the victorious Americans and Western European nations in not offering the proper guarantees that perhaps would have made leaders like Putin and others who are vested with an enormous reserve of insecurity. They didn't offer them anything really to work with in terms of guaranteeing security.
So you think that NATO expansion in the 1990s and 2000s was done in haste?
I believe so. And I think that, I mean, of course, we always fall back on the view that, well, it's the right of any of these nations to join NATO or join the European Union. It's their right, they're democratic nations and all this, which is all fine. But see it from a Russian point of view. The NATO that was created as a foil to the Soviet Union was now getting bigger and more powerful and more numerous in its membership. So it strikes me that that fed the sense of paranoia, the sense of insecurity that Russians like Vladimir Putin have long held.
Let's move on to the next question. Is there a global event or war that has occurred in your lifetime that you, for whatever reason, couldn't report, but you wish you'd been there, you wish you could have reported on?
Well, to be very frank with you, I wish that I was young enough and eager enough and employed enough to be in the current situation. The greatest stories that I have told in my career have been the stories of civilians, people, refugees. If I could be anywhere right now, I would like to be in Poland or in Eastern Ukraine, trying to tell the stories of people who really do need help because they are under an onslaught that none of them ever expected and certainly never deserved. And all of my career, whether it be in Cambodia, where I talked about the refugees and those victims of what was truly a Holocaust in Cambodia, or the stories of Vietnamese boat people, and I became deeply involved for more than 10 years with the story of the people escaping communism in Vietnam. All of these very human stories are what motivates me, what moves me, and those are the stories that I would like to keep telling if I could.
Looking back, what are your thoughts on the coverage of the Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan since their mutation into what we now know as the Taliban?
Well, the sad part about Afghanistan in the time when I was first there is we saw it all in the perspective of the Cold War. It was, again, the Russians went into Afghanistan, they got trapped there, the comparisons were being made to the Vietnam experience by the Americans, and it was the Americans backing the Mujahideen and the Russians having to essentially fight this proxy war on Afghan territory. Now, was it a mistake for Brezhnev to order his troops into Afghanistan? Probably it was. But was it a mistake to order a massive 20-year involvement in Afghanistan by the Americans? Probably it was. Because we were after very, very narrow targets in terms of ridding Afghanistan of those who had perpetrated the 9/11 massacres or atrocities, if you will. But instead we got into nation building in a much, much larger operation than we should have been involved in. At least that was my sense of it at the time. Again, I didn't go back to Afghanistan in the latter part of the American involvement, so I can't really speak to what was happening just before the fall of Kabul. I must say, with the Taliban coming back, that the Americans really seemed to have complete lack of intelligence on what was going to happen in Kabul. And I was actually surprised when the U.S. intelligence on what Putin was going to do in Ukraine was so much better, because they had made such a mess of things back in August of 2021. But I don't know, the overall question, Mujahideen, Taliban, we always saw things in Cold War terms in those days. And then, of course, we saw them in the anti-terrorist campaign beginning in 2001.
And that is quite striking, the difference in coverage when you look at particularly American networks in the 1980s, how they basically conveyed this story of the Mujahideen being freedom fighters against the Soviet Union and so forth. And, Ronald Reagan very openly thanked the Mujahideen for what they were doing. The Americans were supplying them with weapons. Contrast that to post-2011 in the way that, in a sense, the same group of people were treated by the American media. So it's quite jarring, quite stunning, the difference between the two and how the two different phases were reported. And we've got two questions left. One is on the Soviet Union or on present-day Russia, and one is on Vietnam. So we'll begin with the Putin question. When you met Putin in 2003, did he speak remorsefully about the Soviet Union? Did he express any kind of lamentation for the passing or the dissolution of the Soviet Union?
Not in so many words. In the off-camera conversation that I had with him, he did speak about, as I said, briefly, he spoke about his time in Germany. He spoke about his regret that things unfolded the way they did. But he pretty much stayed away from the whole issue of Soviet Union and now Russia. When I met him, he had a very clear agenda. He wanted to project the new Russia, and mind you, he was only 3 years in power when I met him. He wanted to project the new Russia as a European and an Asian power. He had asked me at the time I was involved in management of a number of television operations in India and in China, and he invited me to invite with me a number of reporters, in fact, one from India and one from mainland China. And because he wanted to reach out and position his new Russia, if you will, as a Pacific power. That was his main objective. And he straddled a very clear and careful line between Pakistan and India. India, longtime friend of both the Soviet Union and Russia. And so he was very diplomatic in his conduct and in all of his answers with me. He was looking forward, for example, to a new robust relationship with China. The irony of this, of course, spin ahead to 2022, and you have the remarkable meeting at the Olympic Games between Putin and Xi Jinping. And you see a relationship which, at least at that point, was going to be a very close one and even closer than it had been previously. But at the time when I met him, he was still sort of forging these new relationships. And it was a new relationship for Russia at that time with China.
And while we're on the subject of China, what role can we expect China to play now? Can we expect the Chinese to negotiate some kind of peace, to broker some kind of peace, to lead on those initiatives?
My impression from this distance, and I must hasten to add, it is quite a distance between where I'm sitting and what's going on in Beijing, but my impression is there seems to be some confusion at the top echelons of the Chinese government on to how to handle this invasion. On the one hand, they abstained in all the ways that they need to abstain to remain neutral, if you will, in the UN. They have supported Russia, and yet they have condemned the terrible civilian human cost that this war is now producing. And they have urged negotiation. They have said that sanctions are not the way to go. They have said that escalation is not the way to go. I think in some ways they were taken by surprise by the ferocity of the Russian attack and the fact that it wasn't over quickly. I think there was a sense in a lot of places that the attack on Ukraine would be over in 48 hours. And when it didn't work out that way, and now we're day 9 now, I think there's a lot of consternation in places that you wouldn't have found it had the war ended very quickly. And the Chinese do seem to be a bit befuddled as to how to handle this. And they sort of go back and forth. Will they be, if there is anyone that could offer their services as a mediator, I suppose it would be China. There is nobody else, really. Certainly nobody in the West could be a mediator in this. But the Chinese have not proved themselves in the past as being very good mediators of wars. If they do become a honest broker in this, it would be extraordinary, very helpful, but I would say I have my doubts.
We'll move on to the final question now. And this is again going back to Vietnam. Were you treated differently in Vietnam after the US evacuated? So you stayed in Vietnam for a while, I think, after the American evacuation. You were there certainly a month. It could have been longer after the evacuation. How were you treated? Were you treated any differently after that?
It was actually a little bit less than a month, and I was given a very interesting journalistic choice at the time. The communists who were in charge of what became Ho Chi Minh City said to me, "We understand, Mr. Laurie, that you have a lot of film that you'd like to get out to the rest of the world. And remember, in those days, no internet, no satellite broadcasts out of Vietnam. You've got to get your film out." I said, "Absolutely. Can you help us get it out? Yes, Mr. Laurie, we can get it out, but you will have to go with it. So I was basically left the choice of either getting the story out to the world or staying behind. And of course, there was no choice. I had to get the film out. So I was sort of invited politely to leave after 25 days under the communist regime. In terms of how I was treated, remarkably, very well. Now, of course, we would position ourselves in a certain way to say, we're here to tell your story. We're not going to tell the story, my friends from Hanoi, about you as the aggressor, but rather we'll tell the story of you as the liberator. The Vietnamese use that term Giải phóng, liberation. It was their liberation of Vietnam that I was reporting. It was not the fall of Saigon or the end of the American era. It was the liberation that I was covering. And so long as I sort of painted that appropriate picture, I was all right. There were times where there were some tough moments. Neil and I came across a book burning. All the bourgeois capitalist books that had been on the markets of Saigon for years were being burned by the North Vietnamese soldiers in the city. And we started to take pictures. That was not going to be an acceptable bit of journalism. So rifles were lowered, and with AK-47s at our back, we were marched back to the Caravel Hotel where we had been staying. So there were some tense moments. The saddest part, however, of the experience was dealing with South Vietnamese, some of whom I had known for years, who had been trapped behind, just as my Cambodian friend was trapped behind in Phnom Penh. People who were truly fearful and didn't know what their future would be. Most of them that I knew eventually got out. Some got out by rickety boat into the South China Sea. Some were able to get out to France or other nations through special flights that went out. But the saddest part for me were dealing with those people who I had known for years who were genuinely fearful about what communism would mean to Vietnam.
Jim, thank you so much. Alas, we're almost out of time. It's been an absolutely fascinating hour, not just to hear about, obviously, your career and the huge tumultuous events that you've witnessed, but also your observations about where we find ourselves in the present day and where we might be heading. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here at the Cultural Exchanges Festival. I hope when you've recovered fully, you'll come and visit us in Leicester again and give a lecture to a room for the people.
Kenneth, thank you so much for having me, and I would very much like to come to Leicester and meet you all in person. And because this era for the last 2 years of Zoom talks, it does have its limitations, and I very much feel better when I'm really around people that I can talk to face. But thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And we look forward to hosting you in Leicester in some time in the future. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.